one of two. That is going to be a two-part webinar today and then continued tomorrow, and is all dedicated to people, talent, culture. And today specifically, we are going to start with one of the things that was most important to all of our companies, how to build an impactful board of directors. So this is the topic for today. Today's webinar, as every week, is live streamed on our YouTube channel and our LinkedIn pages on the BioTools Innovator page and MedTech Innovator page. We don't always have our webinars together, but these two webinars are really for both of our cohorts. So hi, everyone on the MTI and BTI cohorts in the Zoom session. For those of you joining us on the live stream and are not familiar with us, MedTech Innovator and BioTools Innovator, powered by MedTech Innovator, are an industry stage accelerator. We are the largest life science accelerator in the world, and have been fostering over 11 years now, over 600 portfolio companies that has gone on to raise over $6 billion in follow-on funding, with over 38 now exits and acquisitions. So very proud of our cohort. We continue to support them throughout our cohorts over the years. BioTools Innovator, our most recently launched program, is focused on life science tools and molecular diagnostics developers. And so we're all here today to talk about, as mentioned, how to build and manage an impactful board of directors. And with us today, we have asked three extremely experienced people to join us to talk about their experience, either as board members or as people that have built boards themselves, or both in Cam's case. And so we'll introduce them all shortly. So first of all, thank you, our panelists, for being here. Hi. I'm really happy to have you all here. I'm Ayelet, by the way. Those of you who do not know me, I'm going to be moderating the call. I'm the Senior Director of Programs at MedTech Innovator, and currently also the Program Director for BioTools Innovator. And so without further ado, let's start talking about the Board of Directors. It's an extremely important function in your company. So let's start talking about this. And before we do that, I'd like to first introduce our panelists. So how about we start with Andrea? Go ahead.
So much. My name is Andrea Henderson. I am a partner in the life sciences, healthcare, diversity, and board practices of DHR Global, based in New York, in the New York office. I am a member of the Private Directors Association and chair of the membership for the Atlanta chapter. I'm certified in private company governance, and I am part of an initiative by How Women Lead to encourage more women to join boards. So I'm happy to be here and hope to be able to share some of the wisdom from those experiences.
Thank you, Andrea. And I think we'll touch on that last point you mentioned about women on board of directors later on in the webinar. Why don't we continue with John Grant? Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks. I'm John, and my background is science and then later MBA. And I currently operate a consultancy, a single member consultancy, mostly focused on various aspects of corporate development strategy. I worked the majority of my career prior to this at 3M. I worked in advanced materials, filtration, and filtration impacts a number of medical and biomedical areas. It's sort of how I got into this. And I've been working with BTI and MedTech Innovator for several years. I'm a member of the National Association of Corporate Directors. It's a slightly different organization than Andrea had described. I find that useful. I've been on a number of boards, both as a member of a strategic company, some nonprofits, and also some startup for-profit enterprises. Thanks.
And in full disclosure, John is also a member of the board for some of our own very own portfolio companies. And so supporting our companies in more than one way. So thank you, John, for joining us today and for your continued support in our program. And then last but definitely not least, Ken, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks for having us. Ken Nelson in Dallas, Texas. I started out in corporate finance out of college, and then when 9/11 happened, decided to completely change careers and get into cardiac devices on the sales side. And so I started with Guidant on the cardiac rhythm management division, which was implantable pacemakers and defibrillators. And then after the acquisition by Boston Scientific, got into leadership and was there for about 10 years, just under 10 years, and then spent the next dozen or so years commercializing and building the teams, cultures, infrastructures for what have become 3 of the 4 biggest players in the cardiac, digital health, and remote monitoring space. First was a company called iRhythm, which eventually went public. Second was a company called CardioNet, which became biotelemetry and then got acquired by Philips in 2001 for something like 2.8 billion. And then was able to disrupt the market third time with a company called Barty Diagnostics, which was acquired by Hillrom, and then the combined companies were acquired by Baxter. And there in 2019, I actually went through MedTech Innovator as CCO of Barty. So, got to experience everything that the accelerator has to offer, which was great. And then spent the last couple years judging most of their global pitch events. Along the way, and more recently, left industry in January to start the MedTech Advantage Fund, which is a venture fund that will invest exclusively in the alumni companies of MedTech Innovator and BioTools Innovator, and then also joined the boards of a half dozen or so companies, including Cardiacare, Heartbeam, Bloom Life, HeartX, and several others. Also an investor in some of those companies, as well as several other accelerators, company ventures in New York City, which is tied into Grand Central Tech, Health Wildcatters in Dallas, and of course, very, very involved with the MedTech Innovator network. So excited to be here today, and have been on both sides, having been on public company boards and also startup company boards, and now helping to put boards together. And on boards from an outsider perspective as an independent board member. I've had a little bit of experience in many different facets of boards.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ken, for being here. And I think, of the many hats you wear, we're going to ask you to wear at least 2 of them today, as in building boards as well as serving on boards. And so thank you all for being here. I think let's dive in, but maybe start with the very, very basic question that all of our companies are asking at an early stage. When is it time to start building my board? So Andrea, maybe we'll start with you, since you help startup build boards for a living. So when is it time to formalize your board of directors? And specifically, in the early stage, companies would ask us, I don't have an investor yet, maybe. Should I wait? Should I just be the board right now myself and wait to have my first investor? When is a good time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we talked a little bit about this. And I think to answer that question, we first need to differentiate between an advisory board and a governing board. And so I would say, if we're talking about an advisory board, which I think we're going to spend most of our time not talking about an advisory board.
Correct.
But to answer this question, I think if you're talking about an advisory board, you can start very early. But the later you go, especially when you go deeper into the fundraising rounds, it becomes increasingly more important to have a governing board. And your investors will want a board and will request a board seat So it will become important once you have investors. And so, that is a very sort of, vague answer to when, because I think the precise time is not, there's no single answer about the precise time. But there is a point where you would need to have a governing board versus an advisory board. Never too early for an advisory board, but when you start raising funds, I would say that's probably when you would want to start thinking about having a governing board. But I'm really interested in what my esteemed co-panelists have to say on the matter.
I was just going to ask, so of the two of you, have you had experience with joining or building formal board of directors prior to fundraising in any case?
Ken, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So what I would say is that it's never too early to have advisors and mentors. You always want them. I feel like I've learned so much from them along the way, and there's no way I'd be where I am today without great mentors and advisors that helped along the way. A formal board, I think you definitely want it when you're fundraising, but you probably want some type of advisory board from the very beginning. And then it's up to you to decide when you want to truly formalize. But when you're fundraising, especially when you're looking for significant funds, you're going to want the help and advice of a formalized board. So that's probably a good time to formalize one, but you can always start out with one or two board members on a smaller board. So I think it's never too early, but it comes down to what do you need and what do you need the board for? And we'll talk about that here in a second, but filling skills and experience gaps is one of the fundamental reasons that you bring different board members on. And so really, when you really start to need something specific is probably when you want to start to formalize the board. And it doesn't have to be 6 people. It can be 1 or 2 to start.
And I think that's a perfect segue into talking about what is the role of the board. And I think we'll touch on, Andrea, you brought up the advisory board, whether it's a scientific board or a medical advisory board. What is the role of the board, especially when you kind of compare and contrast with an advisory board? And so maybe, John, maybe you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'm not an attorney or anything like that, but a board of directors is a fiduciary body that is responsible for management decisions and can be held accountable, particularly if those decisions lead to an adverse event, such as a bankruptcy, and you could be sued, So that's a very, very different responsibility than an advisory board. Advisory board advises management, but management is responsible for their actions. So they're very, very different. And there's subcategories of advisory boards. I mean, there's sometimes a scientific advisory board, a business advisory, all those sorts of things. But I mean, legally, I think those are sort of advisory board. But what the board does is provides oversight. The board of directors provides oversight to the company, assures that the practices of the company are within the realm of the law, signs off on legal type documents and proceedings, holds minutes. It's, a very legal type of environment. And in a startup, sometimes that structure doesn't always exist. So the board has to, amorphosize a bit. I hope that, and maybe there's some other comments on role, but that's my interpretation.
Thank you. Ken, maybe you want to add as to the roles and maybe even the roles, not on paper necessarily, but what are the actual roles of the board?
Yeah, I mean, I think you want a group of people who you trust and who are committed to the mission, overall vision and mission of the company. You also want a diverse group of perspectives, background, and experience. You want people who are going to fill the experience and knowledge gaps that you and your co-founders don't necessarily have. So for example, if you're a physician founder and your co-founder is an engineer and you don't have a commercial person, you're probably going to want a commercial person. If you don't have somebody who has fundraising background, you're going to want somebody who has fundraising in their background. If you don't have somebody who's good from a talent acquisition standpoint, you're going to want to add them into the mix. So part of it is filling in those knowledge and experience gaps and help making you more of a diverse minded group who can view different decisions from different perspectives. At least that's, from a high level perspective, what I think the roles are. And then the role of the specific board member is to help guide and add advice and perspective on how the company is doing, and help them advance from a scaling perspective, and really to make progress along the way and add advice, both good and bad, in terms of some of the things that they're seeing. You don't want a bunch of people who are yes people. You want people who are going to challenge you and help bring out your full potential as leaders and as a company.
And if I can just add one more
good.
thing to that. We've sort of alluded to it, but just really important to call out that one of the main responsibilities of a board is to help manage risk. And so, yes, you want to scale and grow and guide. But, we talked about a little bit about, the downside factors, and there's so many risks, but that is a huge part of the responsibility of a board.
And maybe to kind of add on to that, I'd add a sub question, maybe from your experience with different stages of companies, how does the role of the board change between early and later stage companies? Let's say between, seed or Series A to B, C, and on. Maybe Ken, maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, so if you think about the phases of a company, early on with a med tech company, you're trying to come up with how do you structure the protocols for studies? How do you get your clinical evidence? How do you bring the product through the regulatory process? How do you think through reimbursement pathways? That particular CEO and that particular board is probably going to look very different from the CEO and the board that you need when you're going to start commercializing. So it could evolve over time. You may have certain group of people to help you in the seed and pre-seed stage. And then when you're raising bigger rounds and you're getting ready to commercialize, you may change out some of those board members, and then you're going to keep other ones because you want some consistency and historical knowledge and background throughout if you can. But I think the board's going to evolve based on the needs and the stage of the company.
And we'll talk about these transitions later on in the webinar. Andrea or John, anything to add to that before we kind of switch gears into a different part of the equation?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you go further in rounds of fundraising, you're going to have more investors, which means more stakeholders to manage, which is the fiduciary part of board service. So the more rounds you have, the more investors you have, the more the board profile needs to have that ability to manage multiple stakeholders. The board involvement will probably get a lot more sophisticated, and the board members will probably have to be a lot more sophisticated. And the board composition will be different because you'll have more investor board members, and maybe not, you want to be mindful of how many independent board members there are. So it will change, and it would look different. It will look different, and it should.
Thank you, Andrea. And I think that's, again, a perfect segue into talking about the big question that everybody has is, who should be on my board? So you touched a little bit on independent board members versus your investors, and how many of those investors should be there, the transition, all of that. So maybe let's break it down one by one. Really, who gets a seat on the board? And so I think there are so many sub questions that we have to that, and so maybe the obvious one is really, how many seats do I give to investors, right? If I have a round that is multiple investors, or I have 2 rounds and then 3 rounds, and the more I go on, the more investors I have. How many seats do investors get? Is there a threshold where I say this is an amount of investment where you do get a board seat or you don't get a board seat? Maybe Ken, you can start. Maybe.
Yeah, I think typically in some of the bigger rounds, it's whoever leads the round will typically want a board seat. Not always, but oftentimes they'll want one. You also will often see a threshold in terms of dollar investment that's got to be at least X, depending on how much they're raising to get a board seat. You obviously don't want to give every investor a board seat. It'd be too many, but the person leading the round will typically get one. You also want to have a mix of independent board members because some of the investors will have their own agenda. And you want people who are going to be more well-rounded and can help you. You don't want to have too many investors and kill the balance of the board.
So to your point about a certain threshold, is there a rule of thumb, a percentage, something that our companies can use to guide them in, is this a reasonable request to be on my board?
I mean, I would think that you would want them to put in at least $1 million to be on the board. It's got to be a significant amount, maybe higher than that, depending on how much you're raising. And there's just a lot of factors that would go into that. Would love to hear the other perspectives from the other panelists, though.
Go ahead, John.
There are a lot of factors, and I think a lot of it depends on the exact stage the company's in. And, in the biotools population and the medtech innovator population, I mean, there are different kinds of companies that have different needs. So, the board has to function effectively. So the number of investors, maybe there's an optimum number of investors at different stages. But, the board is somewhat of it's not really a management team, but it's a team. So as you get to very larger amounts of people, particularly people that don't have experience in what a board does, as you find in some early stage companies, there can be problems. Some of the seed stage type companies select board members for very different reasons than experience and governance. So, I mean, again, the board is a governance body. There's an optimum number of people at various stages. And again, the dollar commitment, depends on the situation. But as was said previously, there should be a significant commitment. And again, this is for regular BOD seats, not observers, and all this sort of thing. The other thing I would just want to say, and at the risk of being long-winded, there are different types of investors that come in at different stages of a startup. At the earliest stage, sometimes there are angel investors or, people that are not a fund or, that type of investor. And they may have a whole different perspective of what a board does than, say, someone that comes in for a VC firm at a later stage. So you really have to look at the individual, Andrea can comment on that, how the individuals function as a whole and, how the various gaps are filled, skill gaps.
Absolutely, yeah. And I would also say that in many ways, as a founder, have to manage this board, right? You have to build relationships. So you don't want to have so many that you can't manage those relationships. So you have to be thoughtful about extracting the value, having enough people on the board to help govern and get access that you need, but not too many that it becomes cumbersome.
And I know it's hard to answer these number questions, but is there a magic number? That is kind of again, a rule of thumb. In seed stage, you should have 2 to 3. In A, you should have 5. And there are numbers out there, but from your experience on optimal function of the board.
Those types of numbers are fine, and we can comment more. There is also a compensation element, which also Andrea can comment on. So, I mean, obviously, the more people you have, the more the total compensation of the board is. And that is another situation that has to be optimized. And, compensation, again, I'm getting out of my area, but compensation expectations probably are dependent also on the stage of the company and how much is raised and things like that. So, those are, the number is one thing, but how much the number of directors costs is another thing also.
And we'll touch on compensation a little bit later on, but that's a good.
But I mean, I think
point.
the numbers you rolled out for sort of seed, early stage, a few members of the inception growing to a greater number as the company progresses through rounds. I mean, obviously, if you get to like a large public company, it's there are many directors that are highly compensated, so very different.
Yeah, that's a great point, John. I feel like there's a decision tree, which is why having a number is difficult. And so the decision tree would involve things like compensation and what skills you need. And so if you have a member that could manage the finance committee, the audit and risk, all of the important functions, the bigger committees, then you may not need to add. It depends on, if again, what stage you are in and who's leading the round, and then each subsequent round, how many investors you have, and if you want to balance that out with independent directors. So there is a decision tree, which would, one would need to go through, which would make giving a definitive number very difficult.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And let's maybe pull on that thread, the independent directors. So specifically, the need for an independent director, as Ken mentioned a couple of times here, depends on your gaps, right? What are the skill gaps that you can fill using those board member? But specifically, our companies really want to know, should KOLs like doctors, or in the case of medical device companies, or other, scientific KOLs in the case of our biotools companies, how do you really know if they should be part of your advisory board, or should they really be your board of directors? So what's a good way to guide founders, or especially early stage founders, as to how to manage that?
I'd love to comment on this, but I think, Andrea, I'd love to hear your perspective first, and then maybe John and I can comment as well.
Yeah, so in the governance community, we say a board should have their hands out and their nose in. And from that perspective, you're not managing, you're governing. If you're looking for a KOL to provide guidance and have their hands in, then it should be an advisory board, not a governing board seat. That's my perspective.
I like that. That's a great one. I hope everyone is writing it down. All right.
So I've been facing this one recently, because a lot of these boards are starting to get to commercial stage, and they're asking this exact question. And I feel like a scientific advisory board or medical advisory board obviously is a separate group of people, but having maybe the person that leads that medical advisory board or scientific advisory board also being on the corporate board could add a ton of value. So maybe having one person who's a clinician, especially if you don't have a clinician founder, on the board to add a clinician's perspective would be really, really helpful. Having multiple could get problematic. And then I've also seen clinicians be a problem on the board, just because if they haven't operationally run a company before, they become more of a distraction than anything else. But I do see real value in someone who can bridge the gap between the scientific advisory board and the board of directors. So having one person that's clinician on the corporate board, I do think is helpful.
Is valuable. Yeah, no, that's a great advice, but I will pull on that last thing you said about, the problematic side of having, the for example, physicians on your board, and turn that to John into something we've talked about privately before on what kind of experience would you look for in someone in a KOL, for example. If you're putting a KOL on your board of directors, what would you recommend would be that you'd look for in that person?
Well, again, sort of jumping into the HR world for a second, usually you have some sort of, position description for what the board member might entail. If the KOL matches or has some overlap with that, that would be, certainly some, filtering mechanism. I think, obviously putting people on, and sometimes you find this in the very early stage companies. They think someone from some institution should be on the board because that's the magic answer to credibility or, whatever. In my experience, just as a manager, not so much as a board member, putting inexperienced people in roles and expecting them to perform well, is a bit of a risky endeavor. So, I think as Ken said, getting someone involved in, financial oversight, cyber oversight, all the stuff a board has to do, risk assessment, but that person really has never done any of that, is fairly risky. They can provide an interesting perspective, but that perspective maybe is more valuable as the board is larger and it can accommodate someone that's sort of coming up the learning curve.
And my specific advice recently was for that clinician who really wanted to be on a corporate board, who we're going to have run the physician advisory board. My advice was, let's have them be a board observer to start, and maybe they evolve into a full board member. That way they can experience what happens on the board, add value, but they don't necessarily have voting rights and other responsibilities.
And they could want to do it. Because sometimes people really want to do this sort of thing. It's like then what's behind the curtain isn't as exciting as they thought it was.
It's like that top sales rep
or whatever
wants to be a manager, but then once they realize what a manager leader does, they're like, I hate this. I don't want to do this.
Yeah, go back to right.
And better as an observer.
I mean, you want that way you give them a taste of what it means to be a board member, and it can evolve into a full board seat over time if it makes sense for both sides. At least that's
how common is asking someone to be an observer for the board, and how long do you have until that makes sense to make someone a formal board member?
Well, this has a lot to do with the fundraising dynamics. So let's just invent some hypothetical situation. We can have some company that has funding and we put various people on the board, and it comes time for the next funding round, and the dynamics change because a large investor comes in. So it may not be possible in all cases to elevate somebody to a board position as an observer. Sometimes the observer or advisor roles can be short-lived, and sometimes they could be long-lived. I mean, the dynamics of the situation sort of dictate that, but, it's very situation dependent. I mean, in general, I think people should have an interest in becoming a board, be interested in corporate governance and commit to doing and learning about it. Not just, you're going to do this in this one instance and you'll, fit it in with everything else. And that's really not what I would look for.
Thank you. I think let's switch gears a little bit to talking about how do you find those board members. And so I'd maybe start with Andrea in talking about how do you find the right board members, even if you know what you're looking for and what's the profile of the board member you're looking for, and then maybe turn it to later to Ken and John with a little bit of a different perspective. So Andrea, why don't you start?
Well, I'm going to make a shameless plug for using an executive search consultant, right? You have a partner who's experienced in identifying and assessing talent. And so that is one good way to do it. There are others. So many people rely on referrals. And while that can be quite good, it can also, there is some danger, there's some risk, because you can get a resulting groupthink if you rely too heavily on referrals because your network is too dense. And so you risk not having that diversity of thought and experience if you rely solely on referrals. I would say, especially for those organizations that are cash constrained and perhaps even time constrained, that there are many board networks that could be helpful in that regard, that work to prepare and match current and aspiring board members by their skill sets and their industry experience and things like that. I would say those are the top three, but I equate identifying a board member to identifying a life partner. It is worth spending time to find the right fit, and it's not something that you want to cheap out on. So that's my 2 cents.
No, thank you, and we'll touch on the next stages of that in a little bit. But Ken and John, I do want to ask you. So, as board members, what kind of factors do you consider when you're thinking about joining a board, and what makes you join a board? I think, John, you touched a little bit on you really want to be there, but what does that look like for you in real life?
I could go first. One of the more unpleasant things, I think we'll talk about, good, bad, ugly, is, if a company comes close to failure, you're going to be in potentially some sort of litigation. It can get to be very uncomfortable. So, I mean, one of the things you look for is, does the company have controls? If you're evaluating a company, are there controls? Are there systems? Is there D&O insurance? Stuff like that. Those are some of the things that, no matter how strong the company or the people are, would rule something out. So I mean, I think you have to know the situation you're getting into. But a lot of it is your assessment of the team, both the board, or for me, do you want to be part of the board team, and do you want to be part of the company? I mean, really contribute to the company, particularly when you're in startups, the early stage startups. The board members get involved in all kinds of things, and it has to be an organization that you want to be involved in. I mean, I think those are some things I would think about. I do agree with Andrea, though, the best way to find board members is to utilize either a professional services firm or some kind of professional network. Informally is very, very difficult, particularly if you don't have a description of what you're looking for. Because there's many people that would be cool to have on your team, but what exactly are you trying to accomplish? And, sometimes you see in the very early stage companies, not a lot of thought put on those things. What type of team? I think Ken had talked about that. There's some skill complementarity, but there's also, is this group really going to be able to work together? And I think those are factors that, always need to be considered.
I think people and culture are the X factor on the leadership team as well as on the board, that you really, as Andrea mentioned, you really want to spend the time to get the right people in the right board roles, because if you don't, it's going to be twice as difficult to replace them and bring in a new person. I think I would highly advise against hiring, someone who's going to be difficult for you to let go if they're not performing. So, for example, you don't want to hire your spouse's best friend. You don't want to hire one of your kids' good friends, someone who's going to be a challenge to let go if they're not the right person. So keep that in mind. I'm not saying to don't ever do it, but I would highly advise against doing it in most cases. And then the people that you bring on, you really want them to be engaged, proactive, really believe in what you're doing and the why behind what you're doing and the overall vision and mission for the company. Because if they don't, they're not going to be as passionate as you are when they're talking to investors or KOLs or other people about the company. You want people who are as close to as passionate about the company as you are, and that are going to be good team members and helpful as you go through the roller coaster of ups and downs that is a startup. There is no startup that goes like this. It is ups and downs and curveballs thrown at you and holy shit moments. And I say that because you're going to be thrown stuff that surprises you, and it's how the people react to those really difficult situations that become the most helpful board members. You don't want somebody who's going to run at the first really difficult situation that gets thrown your way as a founder or as a leader within a startup.
Thank you. And turning it back to you, how do people find you for boards? We make a lot of introductions for people, for potential board members, either as our mentors, our judges, so on and so forth. John has a lot of experience in this. You have a lot of experience in this. But outside of this, how do people find you? John, maybe you go first.
How do people find prospective board members? I don't know if I'm the best qualified person to talk about that, but I mean, there are various, different ways on the cost spectrum, right? So we talked about, hiring a professional services firm. Maybe that's the more sophisticated, most costly. There are other things like, meeting people on LinkedIn or, if there's some local group, but, local groups, you do run this risk of, that was mentioned before.
Of groupthink. Yeah.
Groupthink and, really not assembling diverse talent. But, if you, that's maybe a place to start. But I mean, there's, a number of places to find people. Again, I would echo at the risk of being repetitive. It's very useful to understand what you're looking for before you go try to find it. So no matter what mechanism is used, going from informal, inexpensive to maybe formal, more sophisticated, expensive, really being deliberate on what you're really trying to find is important.
All about the planning and what you really need.
Yeah, but I mean, there's all sorts of accelerators and all kinds of people that purport to be able to help startups, whether they.
I can tell you that the ecosystem within MedTech Innovator, BioTools Innovator is a great place to start. I mean, you think about the broad range of people there and just participating and getting proactive and active within the ecosystem. You can find people across all aspects of scaling your business and just in general, operating the business and fundraising. Even within that ecosystem alone, there's a great diverse group of people that can help you.
And related ecosystems around it.
Yes.
The networks of the networks, of course. So maybe let's take it a step further. And maybe Andrea, maybe you want to start. How do you vet a board member? Let's say you've identified someone, and how do you kind of do the vetting process without, that gentle dance or balance of not offering the position, but still, approaching that person?
Well, at the risk of of being repetitive, I still like to use the analogy of dating.
Mhm.
So you have to have a period of courting. And that will include a round of formal interviews where the founder and maybe some others talk to the person and vet them for knowledge, skills, and abilities. But there's got to be some time spent getting to know the person in a less formal way, to assess sort of fit, compatibility, for lack of a better word. I think a lot of people underestimate that time factor
Mhm.
in the getting to know you process. And then there's some assessments, which I highly recommend as well. So there are leadership assessments, there are personality assessments that will give both parties insight on themselves and how they work together. Because a lot of these assessments will say, well, this type of person works well or plays this type of role on a team. And if you have some folks in place, and for example, they're all drivers, you don't want to have another driver on the board. Even if their skills are great, you might want to get somebody with similar skills that might play a different role. So I think the assessment process, the vetting process should be multi-dimensional, references, casual, informal getting to know you, formal assessments, and formal interviews.
Thank you. Ken or John, do you want to add anything to that?
I think asking other board members of the boards that they're on for private feedback is also helpful, or leadership within those companies of the boards that they may be on for confidential feedback is also helpful. I've done that before, or asked those people to be references, and just I think that's another good rule of thumb to get some of the perspective on how they might be for your board.
Thank you. Let's talk about the ugly side of this. So, as in dating, going back to Andrea's analogy, it doesn't always work, right? And so we have multiple questions from companies, and it's a relationship, so it's delicate, right? So how do you fire a board member basically when things don't work out? And specifically, let me start with one example. One of our companies said, I inherited a board with no experience in building life science tools companies, and they provided me with little to no help in moving the company forward. How do I shift or reshape my board without creating bad blood with people that may be prominent, in their community?
I think that specific scenario is a little different than a one-off removal of a board member. I think in the situation you just mentioned, and again, this is just my perspective, you got to rip that Band-Aid right away. And if they're all not helpful, it's almost like you got to maybe keep one and let the rest go as soon as you can possibly find the right group of people. But that example you mentioned is a little bit different.
It's a little extreme, right?
Yeah, then we have this one board member who's somewhat of a cancer within the group, and they're killing the culture of the board. They're not helpful. And coming up with that process, I think, is a little different than the scenario you just mentioned. If you drag that on, that's just like keeping somebody on your senior team who's bringing the rest of the group down. It's going to get worse and worse and worse until you really make some significant changes.
As
Can
far
you?
as the how,
Yeah.
Again, this is sort of a very corporate thing, right? How to fire an executive, or, the only thing I would add to what everyone else is going to say is, you have to have an attorney help with firing anybody. And, sometimes that is less appreciated, particularly in the small companies that maybe don't want to pay an attorney by the hour. But I mean, this is sort of a legal, the mechanics of it are not that difficult, but they can become difficult if someone attempts to do it that doesn't know how. That's why
That is a really important point, and I also think how you do it is just as important as what you say, and you've got to be really careful about what you say, and I also think you have to be really careful about how you do it. And yes, I highly recommend that you have legal counsel help you through it.
Yeah. If I can piggyback, I would say again, using my analogy of the romantic relationship, having a prenup in place is always helpful as well. And so a corporate prenup would be in the governance documents what that looks like.
Mhm.
So if you know that there's a potential for this to happen, think about that in advance of the issue arising, have a process and laid out, and then follow that process.
I think that's a fantastic advice, usually not applied in companies when they start hiring a board. I think that's a really important point. I would maybe want to ask, and to continue on that thread of who's on that board, how do you select that board? So how common is it for board members or board of director members to serve on multiple companies that may be competitors in one way or another? Is that something that you often see? Would you recommend that this happens, or should companies completely avoid that as a practice, in an effort not to get to the it's not working later?
Yeah, there's a lot of risks with something like that, stemming from potential conflicts of interest. So,
do you typically kind of excuse yourself if you know?
yeah, I mean, I think it's just easier to avoid that,
Mhm.
Yeah, I think sometimes people, want to leverage their experience, be on multiple boards. We're talking more about startups here, right? So, startups have a unique risk. They could be out of business quickly, where established companies, have less of that. But, if you get into some sort of situation where you're perhaps contributing to litigation or something resulting from a conflicted role, or even an alleged conflicted role, and people could file suit for all sorts of things. I think that's something, again, that really needs to be carefully looked at, and you really need some legal help to make sure that you have the proper risk mitigation strategies there. I mean, after all, as a board member, risk is your major thing, right? So I think when you get into these situations, you're creating risk for the company. So I personally would be very careful about something like that. And the same type of thing can occur when you have, say, like a strategic, right, that has somebody wants to be a board member on some other company. There's all sorts of potential conflicts of interest that can arise, and not all of those are always foreseen at the beginning. So I really try not to encourage that situation where you have the multiple industry.
Thank you.
I don't know other opinions on that, but you're creating risk.
Yeah, thank you. And it always happens, but when you're having fun, time flies when you're having fun, and so we're almost at the hour. And so before we bid our online audience farewell, there's one point I would like to bring up to kind of close that discussion before we continue to the cohort-specific Q&A. Andrea, maybe let's start with you. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of diversity, introducing diversity into your board of directors? And diversity can be, as you mentioned, diversity can be skills, and really on that side, but can also be gender, race, and so on and so forth. And I think, Andrea, you have a unique perspective on it, so I really would like to hear that.
Yeah, so there is a woman that I'm connected with in my network who is exceptionally skilled in governance. I think she has a PhD in governance, and she's said something to me that was very profound. She said, board composition is not only a risk mitigation strategy, but it is also a valuation strategy. So what she meant by that is that having diversity of skills and lived experience, race and gender, can both help manage risks that might not foresee with too much homogeneity, but it also could add to how you're ultimately valued. And there's a brilliant analysis that she's done in that. So it is extremely important to have diversity. And there are multiple examples of when companies haven't had it and where they've had some blind spots at the least, and at the most extremes, some serious liabilities and missteps that have been very costly. So I think, in addition to the fact that there's lots of activists, investors, and legislation coming that require board diversity, at least for public companies, and some investors that require it for their portfolio companies, it is a really important strategy when you're building a board to factor that in.
And then maybe on top of it being important, how do you actively encourage that? How do you actively put this into practice?
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, we're at a place where it a lot of times becomes very blatantly obvious. If you have no women on the board, if you have no people of color on the board, if you have no talent, folks on the board, if all of your folks have finance backgrounds or science backgrounds, and you don't have anyone who's looking at the talent landscape, then you have gaps. So there are skills matrices, and there are other matrices that you should look at when thinking about building your board. And then there are people and organizations that you can partner with to help fill those gaps.
And really just be mindful that just as much as you, as Ken said, just as much as you kind of try to quantify what kind of skills you bring in, also looking at the same metrics for diversity in other areas.
And can I just add one more thing?
Yeah,
I just want to
absolutely.
say, I think it's even more important for life sciences companies. We're talking about med device or, diagnostics. You have to represent the patient population. And there's a founder that I am very fond of, and she says, for example, women are not just little men. We have different physiology. And so you don't want to treat the patient population as, men are one dose and women are half of that dose, or, so you want to have that perspective reflected. It's literally not only a matter of health equity, but it is a matter of life and death. So I think it's extremely important.
Yeah, we can easily equate that to that same process that was happening with clinical trial representation in clinical trials. Bigger topic, of course. I would want to bid our online viewers farewell so that we can continue to the Q&A. There are so many more questions that our companies would like to ask. And so first of all, thank you all for joining us today. You're welcome to join us tomorrow as well for the talent and company culture webinar, same time, and on the MedTech Innovator LinkedIn page. And thank you to our panelists. Stay on. I would just formally like to say bye for our online viewers, and we'll start we'll turn off the live stream. So